All right, welcome everybody to the installment on governance and representation here. First round of real slides, if you will, or real lecture for Political Science 110. So I'm going to dive right in and hopefully get this done faster than I have in semesters past. So talk about politics here, government and politics. The title of the course is government, but politics is unavoidable. We're still going to keep two basic questions in the back of our minds throughout the semester, one that's empirical and one that's more theoretical, right? What do we observe? That's an empirical question. What's going on? Why, right? And the why requires a bit of theory. So this is why I know it might feel like overkill, but we're going to read two different books, or three different books, as you know, including the one on California politics. But the two principal books are the American Government book and the Politics of Power book. I'll talk about Lowy, the main author of the American Government book, and Katznelson, the main author of the Politics of Power. But they both talk about the same things, but they're quite different theoretically, right? Both of the books walk us through the institutions of government, what we observe. But the American Government book, the Lowy book, is much more laudatory, I think is the word I used on the syllabus. And the Politics of Power is a lot more critical. And that'll be pretty evident here this week. As I start off, I'm going to talk pretty much about the Lowy book first and then the Katznelson book, and that'll give you an idea of the differences between the two. But as we move forward in the semester, they'll all blend together. So Lowy opens up talking very broadly about government, right? Institutions and procedures through a land and its people, or how our land and people are ruled, right? And governments can be simple. They can be like a city council, or they can be really complex, like the U.S. or the Brazilian or the German or the Mexican political systems, which are all federal in nature and all have separate branches of government and levels of government. And government in the United States is quite bureaucratic, as we all know, right? But we'll talk a lot about how you participate in the political system, whether that's paying taxes, whether that's protesting, so on and so forth, right? But the idea in this class is hopefully you learn a little bit about how the government works. Hopefully you learn a little bit, you hone your critical thinking skills, and then you continue to apply them as you go forth in life, right? But government, we complain about it, but like it or not, government's pretty necessary, right? We need it to maintain order, to protect property, and to provide public goods. This first hyperlink here, you can't click on it in the video because, and if I were to click on it and roll this in the video, then my lectures get taken down by YouTube for violation of property rights. So you've got links, hyperlinks in the recorded lecture. You've got the PowerPoint itself posted below the lecture. And below that, you've got the individual links. I make it pretty clear by slide number and line on the slide what the link corresponds to. But if you want to pause and then watch the link throughout, that's fine with me. You want to watch the links later, that's fine too. This is the first one here is a short sort of cartoon that goes back to Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. If you've taken political theory or a basic philosophy course, I'm sure you've heard of the Leviathan. But yes, this gets back to the notion of the trade-off between freedom and protection, freedom and order, right? Any sort of laws that exist to protect order almost inherently limit our freedom in some way, shape, or form. So that's a constant trade-off to keep in mind, and I'll come back to it actually in these slides. Private property, whatever political system, especially a capitalist system, is meaningless without a legal system to protect what's ours. However, the system that we do have also leaves us wanting as a society for certain what are called public goods that are those that can be enjoyed by anyone and are deniable to no one. This hyperlink takes you to a very dated video from South Africa in like the 90s, but it's about the best and shortest video I can find that really explains public goods pretty well. But these are things that for which there are no economic incentives for any private entity to build, say streetlights or sidewalks, or the lines on the road or the roads themselves, right? There's no economic incentive for private interests to make these things, so governments are left to do that. Lighthouses. Right? There's no economic benefit to providing this good. You can't deny their use to anyone because they're just there out in public. And that means that governments are left to provide these goods. So that's another reason why government is necessary. However, governments can try to limit free riding, the taking advantage of these things, through policy and taxation, right? Public schools are free, but people pay taxes to keep them open. But anyway, Lowy continues to talk about who rules. I don't want to dwell on this. We could talk about an autocracy, which is the rule by one single individual, say like the dictator of North Korea. We could talk about oligarchies, which are small groups of landowners, military officers, or wealthy merchants who rule a country. The country we often think about when we hear the word oligarchy over the last 20 years has been Russia, post-Soviet Russia. A small group of folks have been able to pretty much control the system under Vladimir Putin, the president, if you will, air quotes. But we're going to focus more on the U.S. democracy. We're going to talk a lot about the flaws of U.S. democracy, but we need to think about democracy broadly before we get into the details, right? A system of rule that permits citizens to play a significant part in the governmental process, right? Demos are the people, Kratos is power. Other forms of government, or at least limits to government, what governments can do. We can talk about a totalitarian regime, which again would be like North Korea, where there are really no effective limits on government's power. An authoritarian system where there are no formal limits placed on government, but government can be limited by other social institutions. You can think about, like, say, right-wing dictatorships in Latin America in the mid to late 20th century, maybe limited a bit by the church, but not much else. Democratic systems are subject to constitutional limits. That's what limits government power in a democracy, is a constitution, right? The constitution is a document that spells out the formal and effective limits on government power. Governments can make us do things like, say, join the army, serve on jury duty, attend school, and they collect revenue from us, which is how to pay for the military and the courts and schools, etc. And we obey, because if we don't, we go to jail, right? The penal system is why we obey the government. So shifting gears from government to politics, let's think briefly about what do we mean by politics. Well, politics at its heart can be viewed as a conflict, struggle, cooperation, or collaboration over leadership, structure, and policies of government. The classic definition that everybody learns in a basic political science class is we're talking about who gets what, when, and how, right? And politics can take many forms. To determine the who gets what, when, and how, by voting, running for office, joining groups and parties, lobbying. We'll talk about lobbyists throughout. But even just speaking to friends and neighbors about politics, about the government, about what the government does, this is a form of engaging in politics. So does American democracy work, Lowy asks. Well, there are many inconsistencies and contradictions, which Lowy, like I said, isn't as quick to point out as blatantly or as honestly as Katznelson does, which is why I like to use the Katznelson book, even though it's a bit older and there's no new edition. But what we have to do, or what we do in American democracy, is we delegate authority, right? We are, as individuals, are principals in this system, and we delegate our authority to an agent, which is an elected official, right? So popular sovereignty is qualified by a willingness to offload governance responsibilities onto professional agents. Those are politicians, like it or not. We would like to hope that there's some trust in government, and that trust in government generates what we call legitimacy. But it's safe to say that the United States, and I'll end on this note for this section, this lecture, the United States is very polarized, and depending on who's in power and what you think about them, your trust in government and the notion of legitimacy can fluctuate greatly, right? Are there problems with this principal-agent relationship? In theory, we elect people to represent us. We would want those people to be like us. But that's really impossible because we live in a pretty diverse society. And we live in a society that's has a very active media. And I'm not the kind of person who just rags on the media all the time, but this link here, Problems with Principal-Agent Relationship, ? Takes you to a comedy show called Full Frontal with Samantha Bee. I will use a lot of satirical comedy clips throughout the semester, so get used to it. But in the aftermath of the 2016 election, there was a lot of talk about the working class voter wanting to elect a working class politicians to represent them, but we don't really quite understand what the working class looks like. And Samantha Bee stresses the point that the working class is often a lot less white and male than the media made the working class out to be, particularly during the 2016 presidential election. So watch this link. It's pretty informative and funny. Trade-off between freedom and order. Back to that link from a couple slides ago, the cartoon that perhaps you've watched. Is coercion necessary to enable liberty? The safe answer is yes, right? I mean, we can't be free to go killing people and stealing things, right? We need rules, and we need a political system to impose those rules. We also need to be mindful of majority rule, right? What the majority wants isn't always best, right? So this is why the system in the United States is set up, with the 2 chambers in Congress, with different ways to elect the people who enter Congress. And the whole idea is to put brakes on the whims of the majority in the system, right? We can think of pretty easy examples of the problems with that can arise in a representative democracy with this principal-agent relationship, right? Not everybody likes this guy. It's safe to say that probably most of you didn't, but if we go back to 2016, a lot of people didn't like this person either, right? So when your choices, especially in 2016, boiled down to 2 people who really weren't very well liked, that in effect is a problem right there in the democratic system in the United States with its 2 parties leaving us 2 choices. I think in 2020 was safe to say that, and I'm just speaking off the cuff here, that I think Joe Biden, now President Biden, wasn't as disliked as much as Hillary Clinton. But, he wasn't the most desired candidate by a lot of Democrats going back to the primaries in 2020. But then there's a whole other thing to think about, and this is where Katz-Nielsen comes in. This photo does come from page 12 of the 16th edition of the Lowy textbook, the new edition, and there's a brief section on this tension between representation and governments. And the second point that Lowy makes in this section has to do with moneyed interest, right? As you see here, voters, not donors. And I personally think one of the problems with the United States political system is the role of money in it, right? I mean, you can literally buy influence in this democratic system of ours. So now let's shift gears and think about the first chapter of Katz-Nielsen. If you've read it, hopefully you liked it. If you haven't, maybe this will inspire you to do so. What Katz-Nielsen does, he opens up the book talking about the Titanic, right? Comparing the Titanic and its crash to American democracy. The metaphor being that class and wealth determines how you start and how you finish, right? Those who died in the Titanic's crash, especially if you've seen the silly late 90s film that Larson was in high school at the time, and of course had to see it many times and grew to hate it. But, the wealthy people got on the boats, right? The poor people didn't. If you were in first class, there was a good chance when that Titanic crashed that you didn't die. There weren't enough lifeboats to go around, right? And we can think about parallel realities today. We have persistent inequality in this country that goes even beyond class, while the welfare state becomes increasingly smaller, right? So the safety nets that do exist in the system are not as prevalent, present, or powerful as they have been in generations past. And so how you start in the United States democracy, if you're born to poor, undereducated parents, it's going to be more difficult for you to end wealthy and highly educated. That's just how it works. The problem with this metaphor is that the Titanic was not a democracy, right? The captain was not elected. The captain was responsible to investors, not to passengers. And businesses always put profits before patriotism. It might be around the 4th of July, you find advertisements on TV, YouTube, what have you, with companies presenting themselves as all patriotic, but ultimately they're not, right? So this is the constant tension that Katz-Nielsen's going to present throughout the textbook, the Power of Politics textbook, is this tension between democracy and capitalism. I'm not trying to convince you that capitalism is bad, doesn't work, etc. That's not the case, but I'd like you to get a better understanding of how politics works in the United States, and theoretically and empirically, I think Katznelson does a good job of pointing out some of its problems. Right? It's not to say there aren't positives, and Katznelson spells these out too. Right? We've seen an expansion of the electorate over a long period of time, but finally today, most adults are free to participate. You're over 18. You're not a convicted felon. You're a U.S. citizen. You can vote in this country. Now, that wasn't always the case. Again, it's been a long evolution, and it'll be a theme that comes up in coming weeks. But that's a positive here. Public authorities are accessible. My friends in Europe just can't understand that you can send an email to your elected officials and expect a response. I mean, it might be watered down BS, but you'll get one. And in other democracies where I've lived, that's just not really the case. And I do appreciate that public authorities are accessible. Rule is not arbitrary or unaccountable. I have a big ahem there following. It does seem that some people can basically do what they want and get away with it. But ideally, U.S. democracy provides a system that abides by, adheres to the rule of law, and no one is above it. Debate is generally not restricted. We're free to say what we want. That's a good thing. I've lived in Turkey years ago, and while it's nominally a free democracy, there are things that really you just can't talk about openly. And I think we're getting better at this in the United States today, whether that's talking about the legacy of enslavement, structural racism, to talking about abortion. I'm not saying that we've reached great conclusions and things have gotten better, but debate is generally not restricted, and we can say what we want in a class and not have to worry about the police coming in and dragging us off. Democracy has grown over time, like the expansion of the electorate. But again, this is not without great struggle and sacrifice, and we're seeing this now with, say, the Black Lives Matter movement and the negative reaction to it. For a time, the U.S. became a global beacon. In the 20th century, post-World War II, I think the image of the United States is tarnished, and that's been our own doing, I think, since. But that was once a positive of U.S. democracy. Katznelson gets into some of the history that we'll see in the next section of Lowy. So I'll be pretty brief here because you're going to see some overlap. But the United States Constitution as it exists now is really the second form of the second constitution that the United States had. The first was the Articles of Confederation, which you probably heard of in high school, that failed within under 10 years. And it failed because it was too decentralized, right? States basically acted like countries. I mean, that's what a confederation is. It's a looser connection between political systems or among political systems than a federal system. So different states had their own currencies, their own militaries, their own foreign policies, and it was really very difficult to negotiate diverse interests between Virginia and Connecticut, but the system was designed that way. There wasn't a president. The Congress required unanimity. It was too difficult to make decisions, and that's why the decision was made to scrap the Articles of Confederation, which then led to the creation of the Constitution of 1787, which is still the Constitution that's used today in the United States. It's the oldest. Ironically, the United States is a very young country compared to, Iran, France, or India, or China, but, pick a country around the globe almost. But it's the oldest constitution that's still in force, that's still used today. So it's been successful. I put successful in quotes because we can definitely identify flaws in the political system. But some of the reasons that Lowy advocates that explain the success of the United States is the separation of powers, the lack of a concentration of powers without the structural hurdles of the Articles of Confederation. This is true. Checks and balances among these three branches of government. This is going to be a theme. We'll talk more specifically about federalism, that we have states and we still have a central federal government. But this was a reconciliation of interest between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists wanted a stronger central national federal government. The Anti-Federalists wanted more power to the states. But the system that we have now is a reconciliation of these two interests that still surface today. But ultimately here, Lowy talks of a set of institutions designed to adjudicate among conflicting interests while advocating in public interest, right? This explains the success of the Constitution. Again, I'm not here to say it's the best document that was ever written, but it has held up. Katznelson transitions to talk about the determination of who governs. There were different plans at the time during the Constitutional Convention. There was a Virginia plan in which the president was selected by a Congress made up of a House and a Senate, both determined by the size of population, because Virginia had a larger population. So that's why Virginia advocated for that. The New Jersey plan, which at the time New Jersey was a less populous state, so New Jersey advocated for there to be more power to the states, and each state would have the same number of representatives in the House and Senate, which of course the more populous states didn't like. So the Great Compromise, or sometimes called the Connecticut Compromise, came from Connecticut, surprise, surprise, which is a relatively small state, but that had a larger population. And that proposal by the representatives from Connecticut became the legislative system we have today, right? Which is bicameral with a Senate that represents the states, and all states have the same number of senators, and the House of Representatives, which is based on the representatives that a state has is based on its population, right? The problem at the time was how to determine the population of a state, because again, at this time, the only people who could vote were white landholding men, who were adults, of course. But the population, states wanted to count everybody. However, enslavement was a bit of a problem here, right? The original sin of the United States is Katznelson's term here. But of course, you know, we could easily say the original sin would be the genocide that was ongoing even before enslaved peoples were brought to the United States. But the way to resolve this question of determining the population, of course, was the 3/5 compromise, which counted enslaved peoples as 3/5 of a person. This was to placate the southern slave states to pad their population, because they were less populated, tended to be less populated than the states of the Northeast. So anyway, moving on here to determine who governs, talking about the judiciary, the Constitution creates a Supreme Court, whose members are appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. They're lifetime appointments for all federal judgeships, not just the Supreme Court. But the Constitution only created the Supreme Court and left the rest of the court system up to Congress to design. And of course, president would need to sign off on this. But the purpose of the Supreme Court was to resolve constitutional controversies, determine when federal or state law were to apply, to judge how rights are understood and protected. And the Supreme Court has the authority to settle land and territorial disputes, which is less of an issue today than it was a couple hundred years ago. But the first 2 points are still probably the most important things that the Supreme Court does. Think about the executive here. There was a decision to create the role of president because there was a recognition for a need for strength to govern, but not like a monarch. Again, the Articles of Confederation didn't provide for a president as such, because the founders were fearful of a monarch-like figure. But by the time the decision was made to scrap the Articles of Confederation, the reluctant decision to create a presidency was made. Subsequently, a president can only serve 2 4-year terms. Originally, that was not the case. The Constitution was amended after Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected 4 times as president and died during his 4th term. So now, of course, a president can only serve for up to 8 years. But a president manages foreign affairs, is the commander-in-chief of the military, oversees the federal bureaucracy, and has the right to veto legislation from Congress. I mean, we'll talk all about the president here in a couple of sections, couple of sessions, so I won't go into details here, but this is just a quick and dirty presentation. President, of course, selected by an electoral college, which I'm sure you're not a fan of. Most people aren't. And we'll talk at greater length and in greater detail about the electoral college down the road. But each state has as many electors as the sum of its members of Congress, right? So history lesson here, this is 2008, the electoral college map of the 2008 election, in which President Obama defeated Senator John McCain pretty handily. by adding up all the numbers you see here, the blue for Obama, the red for McCain. I didn't include 2012 when Obama was reelected, but the real surprise came in 2016, where a lot of these states in the Northeast and Upper Midwest that Obama had won, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, all went for President Trump in 2016. And of course, using the Electoral College count, Kansas, my home state, has 4 representatives in the House and 2, of course, in the Senate. And thus 6 votes total. California, 55 votes total with 2 senators and 53 members of the House. That's how that works. So again, we go vote on election day every 4 years for a president, but you're really voting for how you want your state to vote in the Electoral College. That's how that works. Note the difference here, 232 to 306, because it's the same vote tally in 2020. Biden defeated Trump by the same count that Trump had defeated Hillary Clinton, 306 to 232. And Biden regained some of the states that Clinton had lost. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, these were key. Georgia was a real surprise in the 2020 election. A lot of people worked hard to flip Georgia from the Republican column to the Democrat column. Arizona was a bit of a surprise. Some of these Western states seem to be undergoing a bit of political shift. And that matters come time to add up the votes in the Electoral College. But getting back to Katznelson, the Bill of Rights came about shortly after the Constitution entered into force, a little over a decade after, as the tension between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists continued. The Anti-Federalists were worried about the power of the federal government and insisted that there be a statement of civil rights added to the Constitution, and that's the Bill of Rights, right? These 10 amendments, the first 10 amendments that have to do with freedom of the individual, right? The First Amendment, the right to the freedom of speech, of religion, of association. 2 to 4 restrict what the government can do, whether that, the government can't restrict the right to bear arms. 5 to 8 deal with the judiciary. The Fifth Amendment, as you know, a court can't make you testify against yourself. You've heard this in TV and movies. 9 and 10 deal with the rights of the people and states over the federal government. The 10th Amendment makes my out-of-state driver's license, valid in California, right? It's this, and it leaves to the states decisions to make that aren't described in the Constitution, which are reserved for the federal government. So anyway, the Bill of Rights is meant to limit the reach of the government and to protect the rights of the individuals. So let's think about democracy, or the standards of democracy, right? It looks like everything's great, huh? Great system, no? So that's the end of it. Not exactly, right? Click on this link, or below on the Canvas page. It's the opening scene to a TV show called The Newsroom, which for some reason I could never get into, but a lot of people seem to like its very first opening scene. And many of you have probably seen it. It's with Jeff Daniels, one of the Dumb and Dumber guys. He's a journalist, and in this opening scene, he's at some unnamed college on a panel with a liberal conservative, and he's asked why the United States is the greatest country in the world, and he goes through a laundry list of reasons why it's not, inequality, lack of education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So where I'm going with this is that it's a good system, maybe not a great system, so we need to think a lot more about it, not just let it be as it is. We need to judge democracy not just by its formal procedures, but how these procedures work in practice, right? So we're transitioning from the theoretical to the empirical, right? The founders created, while the term isn't used in the Constitution, but they created a capitalist market economy. But this economic system exists within a democracy. So the question is that Katznelson comes back to throughout the text is that how democratic is the system, right? With its persistent inequalities, right? And Katznelson is quite critical of what he identifies as the corporate complex, which again is what's briefly described in the Lowy textbook in the section on the tension between representation and governance, right? Corporations have become too big to fail, which is a term that was used a lot after the great economic collapse of 2008, late 2008. Views of corporations unevenly represented in public debate, right? And the majority rule is often confined to a limited range of questions that often are set by large corporations, including the media, right? Because media today is also functions in this capitalist system, and media outlets are out to make money, right? So anyway, and here's just an example. This figure from the Katznelson text gives you an idea. This is a little dated, going back to 2012, but the top 20 Fortune 500 companies, these are not companies that are necessarily out to protect your interests, right? ExxonMobil, Walmart, Chevron, a lot of oil companies, motor companies, technology companies, banks, right? And these are entities and interests that very much have a better understanding of how the political system works than most average citizens do. And that might be why a lot of decisions made in Washington are to the benefit of those moneyed corporate interests and less so to the interests of the individual. So thinking about standards of democracy continued here. Should a democratic system be measured by fair and open elections or the control and distribution of resources, right? And I'm not advocating, and I don't, Katznelson isn't either, when we talk about distribution of resources. A term that gets batted around is the redistribution of wealth. And a lot of our more conservative and Republican friends don't like the term at all. I'm not necessarily advocating in favor for it. But the question I ask, and Katznelson asks in the text, is what should the relationship between capitalism and democracy actually should be, right? How should a democracy look or function? And were we doing this face to face, I'd have the bullets come up one at a time here, and we would chalkboard it out here to map out what we collectively think a democracy should look like, and then we would compare it to what's on page 18 of the Politics of Power textbook. And since you probably don't have that pulled up, toward the bottom of the page, page 18, Katznelson says a successful working democracy requires, and he lists 5 things: widespread participation in decision-making, right? That's voting. An absence of restrictions on who gets to participate and on the fair terms of their participation. So that's voting rights, right? Access to the ballot. Access to relevant and accurate information. This day and age, I worry about that. Number 4, inclusive representation of the interests, values, and beliefs of citizens. And to the larger point, then, therein lies the rub with money and corporate interests influencing politics. And the 5th point, Katznelson says, patterns of decision-making that do not give undue influence to various forms of privilege, right? And that's going well beyond just white privilege, which is something that we talk about a lot correctly nowadays, but various forms of privilege being, say, privilege of the better educated, of the wealthier, of corporations, etc. Right? So we're going to be thinking about how democracy functions and how it should function, how you think it should function throughout the semester. Right? So get used to that here. Key questions to keep in mind here: do the country's representatives reflect the characteristics of those they formally represent? We'll talk about Congress when we get to the Congress section, but the vast majority of people in Congress are older white men who are attorneys, right? And disproportionately wealthier than the average American. Maybe we want people with an understanding of the legal system to shape it, but do we need, does everyone in Congress have to be a lawyer? How representative is that, right? Are representatives aware of and responsive to their constituents' concerns? Corporations don't vote. People do, but we need to be mindful that representatives who we elect often make decisions and respond to the concerns of other entities, right? How does a democratic system work amid inequality of resources, right? We'll talk about that throughout. We're going to watch a film later in the semester called Inequality for All. So again, I'm not going to dwell on this question, but these are the questions I want you to keep in the back of your mind. And I like this quote from Katznelson on page 20. Extreme inequality blocks the full achievement of a fully realized democracy in which all citizens have chances to influence the making of decisions that affect them, right? This is not lefty communist talk necessarily. We're going to have inequality anywhere, no matter what. So please don't think I'm not trying to indoctrinate you at all. But it's a valid question, right? To what extent does inequality block the full achievement of a fully realized democracy, right? Because ultimately those with less wealth have less power, right? And that's the way it is. Internationally, Katznelson ends on this note here. After the Cold War ended in 1991, the U.S. was left as the world's only superpower, with a lot of military bases in a lot of countries and a lot of military spending. The biggest military in the world protects the world's largest economy. China is not far behind the United States, both in terms of how big its military is and how big its economy is. But at the end of the semester, we'll talk about specifically about the military and the economy. But this combination of military and economic power underpins the United States' influence in international affairs, which, is not necessarily a bad thing. I had a professor in my doctoral program in political science who would constantly ask us. He was a Muslim from India, from Hyderabad, and would often ask the question, you're critical of the United States and its reach, but who else would you want in charge? China? Russia? India? It's trade-offs here. We can be critical of the United States and its influence, but do we want to have to worry about what China wants us to do, right? Has the pursuit of security changed how we live at home? Therein we're back to the question of order and security and protection versus freedom, right? Especially after September 11th, this was a real concern. Has the pursuit of security changed how we live at home? At that time, definitely yes, right? We definitely found ourselves with greater government surveillance in the pursuit of security, but as it limited our freedom theoretically here. Domestically, talking about political change, as Katznelson wraps up the assigned chapter, we see increased political polarization of politics. Moderates in both major parties are endangered species. Whether that is Susan Collins, a Republican senator from Maine, or Joe Manchin, Democratic senator from West Virginia. They're rare. They're very moderate, very centrist, and not liked by a lot of the more establishment figures in their respective parties. What shapes the gulf between the parties? And we'll talk about these things throughout the course as well. Race, gender, class, religion, culture, etc., right? For better or for worse. We can find gulfs between, or polarization between people based on these things. So I'm going to end, this is my last slide for the first section here, getting you out a little longer than I wanted to, but still quicker than I usually do, or have in semesters past. But watch these links here. There's a Daily Show interview. Trevor Noah interviews Joy Reid, who's a journalist, a political commentator on MSNBC, and she in 2017 broke down her take on the polarization of the United States shortly after the Trump election. 2018, I've got a link here that's a pretty moving NPR story. Little Room for Social Compromise in the Area of Identity Politics is about maybe under 10 minutes. Radio, NPR's National Public Radio. So radio story on a conservative white Christian family who adopted a child from Ethiopia, I believe. And that experience really taught them a lot about what they didn't understand about racism in the United States. And then this Not Us Versus Them is another NPR story under the StoryCorps banner, which is every Friday on NPR. Two people, sometimes people who know each other, sometimes people who don't, from different backgrounds, talk about the issues of the day. And this is one between a young white woman and a middle-aged African-American gentleman talking about what they have in common, not what they have different between the two of them. So anyway, trying to end on a little more positive note here for your first proper recorded lecture. But there it is. Thanks for your attention. We'll be in touch be sure to get the discussion and reading questions done on time. Bye-bye.